For those of you who don't yet know me, my name is Marcus Gibson. I direct the Princeton Initiative in Catholic Thought and work at Aquinas with intellectual formation. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Stephen Auth. Stephen Auth is here to speak with us tonight on the subject of art, beauty, and the desire for God, and a spiritual pilgrimage through great works of the Western artistic tradition, and how they can speak to us and open up our hearts to the desire that each one of us has for God, to encounter God through beauty. Just a few more words. Stephen Auth is a Princeton alum and Chief Investment Officer of Federated Global Equities, as well as Executive Vice President of Federated Investors. He's a graduate of Princeton. He graduated summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, and received his master's degree in business administration with high distinction from Harvard, where he was also a Baker Scholar and a Loeb Rhodes Fellow. His earlier book, The Missionary of Wall Street, which free copies of are available there at the front of the room, the book was published by the Sophia Institute Press in the spring of 2019. And he speaks around the country on the new evangelization and his missionary work on the streets of New York. He and his wife, Evelyn, regularly give spiritual art tours at the Metropolitan Museum, a tour called Man's Search for God, A History of Art Through the Prism of Faith, which is the subject and inspiration of the book there, Pilgrimage to the Museum, which is also up at the front. Free copies available for you. And this pilgrimage, this spiritual pilgrimage, is also the subject of his talk for us tonight, touching on these themes of beauty and art as an avenue to faith, an avenue to open up our hearts and minds to contact with God, to God's desire to meet us and transform us and heal our lives. Was able to enjoy a conversation with Steve Auth that was broadcast yesterday on EWTN, and I was able to get a bit of a flavor of his vision of the story of beauty and salvation that we see in these artworks. And I was able to, it was impressed upon me how through these works of arts, so many great masters in Western art, we can see for ourselves how God speaks to us, how God meets us in the beauty of the natural world and in the beauty of these great artworks, to kind of break down our barriers and lead us to this encounter, this growth in self-knowledge and the knowledge of God, the God who wants to meet us and heal us. So without further ado, here to speak to us, please join me in welcoming Stephen Auth.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you all for coming. One correction to the bio. The books are not free. They're gifts. A little different. They're gifts from a wealthy alumnus who is a friend of mine from Princeton, graduated in my year. And I always, when I speak at colleges, I like to get an alumnus to participate for giving gifts. So there's both books are up there and they're signed, so you can actually leave tonight with one signed book. It might someday be valuable. The other author of the Pilgrimage Museum is actually the little one in the back there. Ev, can you stand up? My bride of 37 years. And my only recommendation is don't try to write a book with your wife. It's, but it worked out really well for us. So with that, I thought I'd start by just answering the first question on your mind, which is, what is this Princeton graduate doing writing a book like this? And I thought I'd take you to this painting here, because this is how the tour actually became a pilgrimage, which had previously been a tour. You all are at Princeton. The thing to remember here, I know you've got exams to pass and everything else, but in the end of the day, and particularly, how many folks take art history here? And the art history department are famous for their exams. They'll show you paintings that you've never seen before, so you really can't memorize an answer. They're teaching you how to approach art, and it's the beginning of a journey. So for me and for Evelyn at my side, it was a journey to discover more about art over the next 40 years. We would always when out-of-towners come to New York, take them to our little tour of the classics of the museum. And one day, about 12 years ago, I had already come much closer to what I would call a reversion experience. I was born Catholic, but frankly, by my 20s was an indifferent agnostic. I hope that doesn't happen to you. But through a series of pings from the Lord, and I won't go to it here, came to a kind of deep conversion. And with that background, I'm standing in front of this painting. You may have seen this painting before. It's called Bathsheba at Her Toilet by Rembrandt. And the docent is given a kind of classic Princeton Art History Department rundown of this painting. This is from Rembrandt's Oriental period. The brushstrokes tell you right away, this is sort of middle period Rembrandt. They're not quite as fine and precise as his early works, not as broad as his later works. And it's famous because it's one of only 2 nudes. There might have been a third, but very few nudes that he ever painted. He painted in Protestant Amsterdam, which was a very kind of puritanical culture in the early 1600s when this was painted. So that's the background. But as I'm standing there, I'm thinking, okay, she's got this completely right, but she's actually got it completely wrong. And it dawned on me that this painting wasn't actually a painting of Bathsheba at all. It was a painting of the image of Bathsheba in David's mind as he was playing with the idea of what might happen next. So it's what a priest friend of mine likes to call the second look. He says, Steve, the first look's not your fault. The second look is. So it's that second look, and I think maybe the third and the fourth look. And the viewers of this painting in Amsterdam would have known the story, but I'll just summarize it for you all here, as I think you're probably aware of the story of this group, but this is the story of the fall of Bathsheba, and sometimes I think the name of the painting could be The Slippery Slope of Sin. David's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's not with the army where he's supposed to be. He's hanging out, and you can see him, well, maybe not here, but if you look in the image in the book, maybe you can see him in the upper left-hand corner on the turret of the castle. So he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's looking around, the eyes are wandering. He sees Bathsheba, begins to toy with the idea of what it might be like to be with her. She comes over. They have an affair. So now he's committed adultery. She gets pregnant, and now the integrity gets attacked here because he's got to figure out a way to cover it up. He invites her husband back from the front, Uriah. Uriah is invited to spend the night with his wife and tells David, no, I need my places with the army. I shouldn't be with my wife right now. So he famously leaves. At that point, David has Uriah executed because once he finds out Bathsheba's pregnant, he's going to know. So that's the story. And what Rembrandt is really painting here is David's fall. And you can see kind of how eternity is slipping away from him. I mean, the darkness of sin is surrounding. The devil's kind of focused David's attention with that light on Bathsheba. And can you see the peacock in the lower right? That's the symbol of eternity. It's down there. So the peacock is fading into darkness. Rembrandt's soul is fading into darkness. And, well, there's a way back right through Psalm 51, which you could read tonight. Psalm 51. That's his way back. Now, at a deeper level, which we only really figured out once we decided to change this entire tour, which we did basically right after this experience. I came home and told Ev, hey, sweetie, we're doing this all wrong. This is really about man's search for God. And if you take the proposition in Ecclesiastes that, I've written the timeless into their hearts, that's what we call this presentation, right? That God is eternal beauty, and that he's given these artists a particular talent. He gives all of us a talent, or more than one talent, but their talent to describe beauty, right? In some ways, all artists are seeking beauty. They're kind of seeking his image in their own soul. And I always ask people to take the pilgrimage. just start with that assumption. Just grant me that. You may disagree with it, but grant me that, and let's go through the art assuming that that is true. And when we did that, the floodgates opened. I mean, suddenly, what seemed to be disconnected events and images start to connect over time. And that's one of the unusual things about the so-called tour of the Met, that the Met has no tour like this. It's 3.5 hours long. It covers the entire history of art over 5,000 years. We're up and down back staircases to do it. They wouldn't attempt something this ambitious, but if nothing, I don't lack ambition. So off we go. But the reason we do that is because it's not until you see the arc of history and the search that you really start to see these themes come through. And then you start to see even more interesting things. Like, for instance, the mark of the garter on Bathsheba's leg. Do you see that? There's a garter mark here. And this bothered especially people in her camp. It bothered people in Amsterdam, but it continued to bother people to this day with various theories about what the garter represents. Because after all, Bathsheba wouldn't have had a garter. And Rembrandt did everything intentionally, we can assume. And what the painting's really about, I think, isn't David at all, but Rembrandt himself. Because at the time of this painting, he's having an affair, possibly with this woman. We're not sure who she is, but I think it's his housekeeper. And it's kind of his Psalm 51. I'm going to take you back in time to the very beginning here. And I'm going to try, in the time that we have, give you some of the themes that come out in a very short review, so to speak, some of the themes that come out from this pilgrimage. And one here is the very beginning of the tour. It's in the tomb of Perneb. And the theme is called Big People, Little People. And I like to tell people, how many have heard a priest tell them you can't take it with you? You never saw a U-Haul following a hearse. So very Catholic, right? So this is a U-Haul following a hearse right here. So that was Egyptian spirituality. Now, the interesting thing about the Egyptians is all of their art is seeking the eternal. It's all in the tombs. So they were seeking the eternal, which is a good start. But like many of us that are seeking the eternal, they get mixed up along the way and confuse themselves with God. And when we do that, we end up in a museum instead of in heaven, right? That's kind of what happens here. So, okay, I think you guys know when this is not a pharaoh; it's a wealthy noble in the pharaoh's court. So it was a smaller. It's called a mastaba. It's not a pyramid, but it's a smaller tomb structure. Same concept though. You bury all your favorite things with you. You enter into this antechamber, and there you kind of enjoy your favorite things for the rest of eternity. You have a big party. Everybody in Egypt knows this, so obviously the tombs all get sacked. The half-life of the tomb, is 50 to 100 years generally. But they always had a plan B, which is the painting here. And you can see in the painting, Perneb has had all his favorite things, the pheasants, the wine, the grapes, the music, all brought to him by his servants. And importantly, he's seated bigger than life. When an Egyptian is portrayed seated, he's portrayed as a divinity. So Perneb is making himself God, in effect, and trying to carry everything with him. And usually at this point in the tour, my pilgrim folks are kind of smiling and smirking at poor Perneb, what a dope, he screwed it up. And then I ask, how often in your own life have you made yourself God, right? Now, I do it a lot. I think we all do it a lot. The sin of pride, it's original sin in some ways. And so you'll see this theme come up quite a bit. And here's a case of this. And there's a funny story in the book, and Evelyn's here not to defend herself. So I'm taking Evelyn through this redesign now pilgrimage, if you will. And she says to me, Steve, we really need to have this painting in it. I go, sweetie, not really. I mean, Lorenzo Monaco, he's a lesser Renaissance artist. We got to make room for all the greats. But Steve, I really think this is important. And, so we're talking about it. And the more we talk about it, the more I realize, oh my goodness, why do I keep saying no when she says to do something, So let me give you how she describes this painting, which is really interesting. So, and here's, I'm in the art history mecca here of Princeton. So I think if there are any art history majors, are there any here? You would really appreciate the point I'm going to make at the very end. But for now, okay, we have this big people, little people thing upside down now, or right side up, right? You've got Jesus, Mary, the Holy Spirit, God the Father. So what's going on? Mary is pleading with Jesus to save these sinners. And she's showing Jesus her breast. That's, like a good Jewish mother, as Evelyn would say, I fed you for goodness sakes. You got to listen to me. And that's why we view Mary as the ultimate intercessor, because Jesus really can't say no to his mother. We saw that at the wedding of Cana. The great scene where he objects and then she doesn't even react. She just says, do whatever he tells you. It's perfect. So, and she's actually, there's a little cartoon caption in here where she's saying, by my breast I fed you, you've got to save. And then Jesus is pointing to his 5 wounds up to the Father and say, Father, this was the reason that I sacrificed myself to save these sinners. And the Father looks down with the love of the Holy Spirit and assents to that salvation, right? And what's wonderful from a Catholic perspective is the artist has really sorted out the role of Mary in this scene. So Mary has a halo, as do the others. The halo means that they're known to be in heaven based on, some sort of evidence, if you will. Okay, so Mary's in heaven, obviously. So, but what's interesting, if you look at the halos carefully, the halo of the Trinity has a cross in it. The halo of Mary doesn't. So they're gods, she's not. We don't worship Mary as a god. We pray to her to intercede for us with her son. The other thing that's really beautiful is the way, isn't it the way she kind of gently, they're afraid to get too close and we're all afraid to go to confession, right? But she's kind of pushing them and encouraging them. And here's the really cool part. So this painting would have been very expensive, by the way. It's blue lapis. To get the blue, you had to grind down lapis gemstones into a paint. This is 8 feet tall. Okay, I haven't tried to figure it out, but I'll just guess it's the equivalent of like $1 million project to paint this. And it's painted in 1410 or so, just at the turn of the 14th century. That was a period of what at that time was International Gothic. So the medieval artists tended to paint things in 2-dimensional abstract images because these are people in heaven. They're idealized. And so this is classic International Gothic, Mary, Jesus. You can see they're idealized, sort of 2-dimensional figures. They're in heaven. They're not here. But by 1400, this new style of the Renaissance had begun to emerge. Giotto, 100 years earlier, had started it with these more solid figures that are clearly not there, but here on Earth. And they're portraits. They're not idealized people. And if you look at the group of sinners, if you will, these are portraits of a family. It's hard to see in this big slide, but you can check it out in the book. The father's probably in red there, and it looks like one of the daughters became a nun, and they're clearly not idealized images. So what's going on here? Who are these people? They're the patrons of this painting. They have to be. They had themselves painted in. They're Perneb. But unlike Pernod, they had themselves painted in as sinners, the little people looking up to God, the big person. So this big people, little thing, you are God, I am not, is sort of the solution. Now, I thought, let's react slowly. So I want to show you one of my favorite paintings. And, we try to keep the paintings in the pilgrimage to be true to the tour that we do at the Met. So they're mostly drawn from the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, but there's just a few that we just have to cheat on. And this one's not really a cheat because it was actually at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for just a few weeks. This is called the Virgin Annunciate. I thought you all might react to this because you're all in a position of being called, if you will, right? So, excuse me, this is the Annunciation scene. Now, what's interesting about it from a historical perspective, it's the only Annunciation scene painted in this era without the angel in it. So think about that for a moment. Typically, the Annunciation scenes are very formal. The angel appears with the telegram, Mary reads it, says, okay, I'll do this. She's in a kind of a very nice setting. But that's not how it went down, right? It went down more like how it goes down for us when we get a call from God to do something, and you wake up the next morning and you say, did that really happen? Was that an angel or what? There's an ambiguity here, and Messina is onto that ambiguity. He painted this painting, by the way. I call it the Catholic Mona Lisa. It was painted virtually the same year as the Mona Lisa. And to me, the Mona Lisa is spectacular, but this is, if you ever get a chance to go to southern Italy, to Palermo, go see this painting in person. It's just a stunning image. And you can see the angels there. By the way, do you see the fluttering pages? So the wind as he rushes in. And what I love about it is Mary, her first instinct is to protect her modesty. There's she closes her veil. There's this strange angel in her bedroom. It's all dark. She's alone. No one to call for help. And then her next instinct is what mine always is when I get a tough message. Like the hand goes out and says, slow down. But what's different about Mary is, can you see Messina actually shows the hand going from stop to let me think about that. And she's actually discerning. So this is prayer at its ideal form, where we're actually listening to the word of God. Instead of talking, we're discerning, what does he really want me to do? And you see those eyes? They're locked in to the angel. So she's really thinking about this. Now, it's not a pleasant lot of thoughts. I mean, being the mother of the Savior of the world is a good idea. But on the other hand, if Joseph disowns her, which is likely, she will be stoned the next morning in the public square, full stop. If he goes along with her, Herod will be after them because this is the new king of the Jews. And if they escape Herod, surely the Romans will want his neck. And their only escape route is a 500-mile dangerous trek across, a desert full of armed robbers. And she says yes. And this is the thing I would challenge you on. How many times do we say yes and we kind of are trying to just move the conversation along, or we just forget? We don't quite get around to the yes. And then look back at Mary's lips and tell me, what do you think? Right, you're going to put your money on this girl. She's going to get the job done. So this image here is another Mary. This is Mary Magdalene. And I should add another painting that the little one in the back has added to this pilgrimage, but another one that is so full of mystery. Now, it's called the Penitent Magdalene, so right there you have a hint what you're looking at here. It's by Latour, painted in very Catholic. This is painted around the same time as as the Bathsheba painting by Rembrandt, so in the mid-1600s. Very Catholic area of France in the Alsace Valley, devout. And at the time, mistakenly, they believed that Magdalene, there's a kind of a misidentification in the Bible. I won't go through that whole story, but they thought she was the prostitute. They kind of conflated her with the story of the woman caught in adultery. She was another woman that had 7 demons driven out of her. But so just work with that. I mean, they believed Mary, that was her previous job, if you will, as a prostitute. And you see Mary here at the moment that she's returned home after this initial meeting with Christ. And she's been sent on a new course by that meeting. She's still got her working clothes on. So in France in the 1600s, this dress would have traditionally been the kind of dress that a prostitute would wear. The long hair would be another signal. So she's still kind of in her former life clothes. She hadn't had time to change. But she's thrown the jewels away, the tricks of her trade. Do you see them? Can you see them up there on the table? So the jewels have been tossed aside. There's actually some on the floor as well. And she's committed to a new course. She's calmly now holding her mortality in her hands. She's contemplating her own eventual death and realizes there's another way to go here. But at the same time, probably like Mary, she's thinking this could be difficult. And this is a key thing for all of us in the spiritual life, right? The pearls of yesterday are always an arm's length away. And even things that we've committed to not do again, those temptations are still there. And I think Mary is thinking about this, Magdalene. And then she turns to the mirror, which is, after all, her favorite thing up until this moment, right? The silver-edged mirror, her image. And she turns to the mirror and gasps. Because instead of seeing herself, she sees Christ, the light, the candles. And he's saying to her, Mary, Mary. So she knows he's going to be with her on this journey. She's not alone. And that's one of the beautiful things, I think, of the way Latour understood this transformation that we all go through. How am I doing for time? Okay, well, now, sorry to stuff 2 Rembrandts in here, but this one I think really works a lot for a Wall Street type giving a talk like this, so I'll tell you about this painting. It hangs in the Met, although they recently have put it into storage. They make me crazy. But, I like to walk by this with our pilgrims who by now, we're an hour and a half or so right up into the thing, and they're gripped. And we get here and I'll say, well, now we're gonna take a look at Rembrandt's greatest self-portrait. And I almost wait for one of the docents to go by because I just love to torture them. Because they know this is not a self-portrait. I mean, we actually have 2 other self-portraits of Rembrandt right next to this. His visage is different, right? So they're going like, this is what you get. You get an amateur doing this thing and, this happens, right? And it is his greatest self-portrait. This is a portrait of Rembrandt's soul in struggle. So one of Rembrandt's problems was he would get asked to do these paintings remember, by now, the patrons of the arts are these wealthy merchants in Amsterdam. So they're kind of looking for interior decorating projects. And Rembrandt, he had a talent, he thought, to transport people to God. And he had his own struggles. I mean, he was a real guy. He wasn't, he was in the arena, so to speak. And, well, if you did what the patron liked, they gave you a gold chain. Rembrandt got exactly 0 gold chains over his career, and you may know, died bankrupt buried in a pauper's grave. Probably the greatest painter in the history of mankind, buried in a pauper's grave. So here he gets asked to paint a painting of a Greek philosopher. So he decides to paint his own self-portrait. So what's going on here is the philosopher is Aristotle. We know that because the painting wasn't titled. It's only been titled later as people discovered this component. If you look at the medallion here, at the gold chain, actually in the book, Sophia, who really did a beautiful job, by the way, with this book in my mind, just creating this feeling of the tour and how they position the paintings, but they actually have a little focus in of that little medallion, and you can see on it a third portrait in the painting. It's Alexander the Great. We know that because we have a lot of Alexander the Great coins. So he paints an image of Alexander the Great. So this coin is the ill-gotten wealth of the world, this gold chain. It's been sent to Rembrandt by his it is Rembrandt, but to Aristotle by his most famous pupil, Alexander the Great. He's out pillaging the world. With his right hand, Rembrandt got his hand on the bust of Homer. This is virtue. This is classical virtue. This is a lot of the virtues that were adapted. We added faith, hope, and charity, but a lot of the other classic virtues, integrity, self-mastery, came in here from the great classical age of Greece. So Homer, Aristotle, has his hand on virtue, his right hand, and his left hand on the gold chain. And what's fantastic about the painting, hands are difficult to paint, okay? Much less hands that are doing what these hands are doing. They're moving. Can you see that the right hand is actually kind of touching lightly the bust of Homer, and the left hand is fingering the gold chain. So Rembrandt's in the middle of a decision here. Well, Aristotle is, but it's Rembrandt, because he is at this time struggling with a great moral crisis, which I alluded to earlier. And then you look at the image of that face, and this is just paint on canvas. It's an amazing image. It is really a soul in struggle trying to decide which way to go here. And you can't tell which way he's going to go. A lesser painter would have been maybe able to paint which way he was going to go. But to paint a face that potentially is going either way is really interesting. So to me, I like to tell people, look, Rembrandt wanted to pursue a virtuous life. We all do. But virtue is, a lifelong commitment, and it's a daily struggle. It doesn't just happen that you get converted and you're suddenly a saint for the rest of your life. The pearls of yesterday are there, and you're struggling with this. That's part of what comes with the spiritual life. And then darkness falls. Caravaggio's last painting, a lot of you know the story of Caravaggio. Grew up in the slums of Milan, orphan, rough character, but very gifted artist. He spent most of his short life on the run from various barroom brawls, at least one murder, probably more, but always would find another wealthy nobleman to sort of protect him, and in exchange would do some more paintings, and he moved around. And this is his last painting. He's on the run again from Malta, and he's worked a deal with the Pope to be allowed to come back to Rome, and mysteriously dies on the ship. A lot of speculation about how that happens, but the last thing he paints is this painting of the denial of St. Peter. And, I think I don't need to tell you the story too much here. This is Peter's denial. The handmaid pointing first, the guard second, Peter with the two fingers to emphasize the third denial. And what I love about the painting is that it really picks up on what happens to our own souls when we deny Christ. The darkness envelops us, and you see the image on Peter's face There's another motif in this tour, this pilgrimage, of these images on faces. And this picks up on one that we would have talked about earlier, but this image of almost terror at what he's done and utter despair. And Caravaggio, I think, in a moment of hopefulness, because I think he was sort of in this state himself, but in a moment of hopefulness, brings in the light here. And it's hard to see, but in the dark in the back is a fire where Christ is. And the light of the fire is bouncing off the armor of the guard and lightening Peter. So what he's alluding to here is Peter's reconciliation. I mean, Peter famously fell a lot, but he kept getting back up and coming to the Lord. And that is actually a key element of the spiritual life, is, getting back up off the canvas. Now, art gets pretty dark, and there's a chapter at the end of the book called The End of the Soul and the Death of God. It's not at the very end. We end on an upbeat mode. I won't tell you what that is. But, once secular atheism takes over, they call it the Enlightenment, I call it the Endarkenment, and God is dismissed, if you will. What happens is loneliness and despair starts to come through in a lot of the art. Remember, these artists are uniquely talented to paint God in some ways. Yet they buy into this whole thing, and they're kind of, I think in many of them, we explore their lives a lot in the pilgrimage. They're seeking something, and they feeling, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with Hopper as an example. There's a lot of Hoppers at the Met. The Met kind of put Hopper in business. They sponsored commissioned many of his early works, and they have a huge collection of Hoppers, but they only show one at a time. It's kind of annoying. But this one was being shown until recently. They got another one. But this is, view from the Williamsburg Bridge. And I think I don't need to go into too much detail here. You can see the loneliness in this painting. I mean, here we're in a cityscape with millions of people, and this poor woman is the only image in the whole thing. You can see her up there, the little white image there in the window. She's clearly completely alone and cut off. And this is kind of what happens when we cut off God. I thought this would be a nice painting to end, because I want to leave time for Q&A. I actually tried to use this painting. I alluded to it last night on the EWTN show. And people were asking me about how someone on Wall Street could possibly be a Catholic, basically. And, my standard response is, well, I don't know how someone could be successful on Wall Street without being a Catholic. And that's not to commit an HR violation. I don't insist that everyone go to Mass on at noon and pray the rosary with me in my office. But I do believe that Catholic values, which I witness in the workplace, have made me more successful. Servant leadership, integrity, humility, self-mastery. I mean, especially in the investment business, where emotions can run very high. And being able to say, okay, let's all take a walk around the block here. So this is an image about dignity. And, another thing I said last night is I said, all this woke stuff, this is coming out of a post-Christian culture. But we have to remember, as Catholics, this is our ground. This is our ground. The dignity of every individual is a Catholic idea. Now, God needs to be part of that. That's what gives them dignity. And frankly, I didn't say this because I could get arrested, but that's an exaggeration for the tape. But really, if you think about it, if you don't believe in God and don't believe that people have his image in them, in their soul, which if you do, it's very easy to treat everyone with dignity. I mean, it's just natural. I mean, this is a beloved son or daughter of God. But if you don't believe any of that, you need to take a lot of classes explaining exactly what you can do, exactly what you can't do. You can say this, you can't say that. This comes naturally to a devout Catholic, So this is an image here, Juan de Pareja, and he is a slave, actually, at the time this is painted. Velázquez, who is one of the most famous artists of his generation. This is in the 1640s. He's painting all these portrait paintings for the King of Spain and comes to Italy on a project for the king. And of course, the Pope finds out he's there and he says, well, Velázquez is here, paint me. So now Velázquez got to go down to Rome to paint the Pope. He has his servant with him who he had inherited from his parents, Juan de Pareja, who is clearly of North African descent. Remember, Spain had only a couple hundred years earlier been freed from the Moors down there in Granada. And so there was a lot of intermixed races in Spain, but often the Moors ended up with the short end of the stick. They were the servants, okay? So Juan de Pareja is one of those. But he says, Juan, pose as the Pope. I can practice how I can do this portrait. So here you have a slave as a Pope, as a king, if you will. And what's wonderful about it is Velázquez sees his fundamental dignity in this painting, even though he's got these worn out clothes, and believe me, the subsequent portrait of the Pope is much more luxuriously clothed. But look at that image of Juan de Pareja speaking to us over the centuries, like, I'm a beloved son of God, and I know that. And what's really fascinating is that when they get back to Spain, Velázquez frees Juan de Pareja. I think he was somewhat transformed by the process of painting this painting and could see his ultimate dignity. Juan de Pareja, if you go to the Prado on your junior year abroad or whatever, you'll see some Juan de Pareja paintings in the Prado in Madrid. I'm going to break. I've been talking a while. I always bring extra paintings I can talk about, but I'd rather go to Q&A and see what's going on. Oh, on the books in the back, again, those are gifts. We signed them both. If you want them customized, I can put a little prayer in for them. You got to see me afterwards. But I was afraid some of you might be in a hurry, so we just pre-signed a bunch. And there's more, actually. I think we've got more if you need more. So with that, should we open it up to Q&A and see what people want to ask?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yes, we have plenty of time for Q&A from students and alumni as well. So don't be shy. Raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll bring the mic over to you.
Now, I'm going to be very disappointed at this group. Like, I was, in this live audience with, some Catholic tourists from New Orleans last night in Birmingham, and, sort of octogenarians, and they were mostly, like feeling a little out of their pay grade, asking me a question. But I know that here at Princeton University, you guys will have questions. So, yeah.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting to look at these paintings and have like a very expert opinion on where to look, what to notice. And so that leads into my question. For starters, I'm a graduate student in the Slavic department. I look at like Russian poetry, and oftentimes when I look at very complex poem, I'm looking for the formal like characteristics, right? Like what words rhyme, what sounds repeat, etc. And so for those of us who don't have much training in like art analysis, what are the kind of like formal like questions that you ask when you try to uncover what a painting means? What draws your eyes first, second?
Well, having been trained here, and in full disclosure, I was not an art history major. I was a history major, econ minor, but I don't know if they still allow you to take a 6th course if you do pass-fail. So I had all the art history courses pass-fail because I couldn't fit them in. I had some, but that training is important to understanding a painting for sure. And over the years, I developed my own method. So let me give you how I look at it. And if you read The Pilgrimage, it's not didactic. I'm not that kind of a writer. It kind of leaves a lot of things to connect. But it might become, you might start to see after a while the answer to your question. because you'll see frequently what I start with is the historical context. I think any artist needs to be understood in the context of the culture and the history of what's going on at the time he's painting. Today, a lot of scholars kind of transpose their own the current context into the thing. That's a legitimate way to think about it, but it's not going to tell you much about what this artist is trying to do, you know? So yeah, I start with the context of the culture as the background. Then I'll look for certain signals technically that help me think about technically what's going on. Like as an example, in the chapter of light and darkness, one should be very attuned in the Baroque period to how light is used. And you know, light is very important. The artist is trying to do something very purposeful. Also should be attuned to the vectors in the painting, like which way is he pointing your eye, you know? So that's an example. In the Renaissance, it's a completely different thing. There's these very formal paintings, and you know, you got to really look at, okay, what's in each of these pieces of the composition, what's in the center. So every period is different. I mean, you saw in the Masaccio, Lorenzo Monaco, I should say, how we kind of looked at the different styles. Like, is this image painted in 2-dimensionality or 3? And you had a very unusual case here of both. But there's always a meaning behind that. So, and then the third is really to bring the spirituality to it. And I think that's one thing that's really unique about the pilgrimage, because we assert that that spirituality is present. And we're very confident of. I mean, the reason this book got produced was that these pilgrimages, the Met has 45-minute tours, sometimes an hour. And it isn't the case, you know, you go to these art museums and you're kind of excited, and after the first half an hour, you're kind of glazing over, but you don't want to leave. It seems like you're a bore. So you say, but you know, it's all without bringing the spirituality into it, which most of the art is about. You just glaze over. But on the pilgrimage in the museum, 3.5 miles up and down back staircases, scrambling around to, you know, the Met has nothing like this. Our tour groups are gripped. We have people following us to add themselves to the group, and the guards are coming over from their stations and so I know that we're onto something here, whether it's scholastically correct or not. And so that's always the third dimension that Evelyn and I really kind of look at. And you'll see that, you'll pick up on that, not in a formal way, but you'll see mostly all the stories kind of have those elements in them. Other questions?
Thank you. We have a question from Andy Strenu, Princeton class of 1974. What are the most interesting 20th or 21st century paintings to you where these themes are present, even if less overtly?
Yeah, actually, we have quite a number of 20th century paintings in the museum, and you know, I have one or two here. I mean, obviously, you have Picasso, and Picasso, who was born in a very Catholic culture, fairly quickly becomes an atheist and a denier of God. And he has this painting at the Met called Blind Man's Meal. And to me, it's a haunting image of a blind man. There's a wonderful image by El Greco earlier in the pilgrimage. There's several by El Greco, by the way. And El Greco had a huge influence on Picasso, by the way. Huge influence, but not spiritually, in terms of the modernity of his paintings. And a lot of people think that modern art was partly invented by El Greco. And so there's a reference here to a famous painting by El Greco called The Curing of the Blind Man. And this one is his answer to it. You know, there is, now it's just bread and wine. there is no miracle, and he's alone. It's such a different image. And you see these things popping up through the Met as we go through. I have an image by Monet of Rouen Cathedral, and it's an image for me of God's tomb in his mind almost. Seurat, the loneliness of the individual. So there's a real kind of darkness that emerges in modern art. And then it all comes apart a little bit with the invention of Cubism by Picasso. Actually, he invents it. I don't have the painting here, but you could look it up. The Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso finds a painting in a dusty art gallery in Paris in 1903 called by El Greco, which is called The Opening of the Fifth Seal. And it has this marvelous image of divine love, the martyrs from Revelations up and in heaven. And Picasso takes those figures, which are very modernly displayed, and he transports them into a painting I'm sure you all know called the Demoiselles d'Avignon. So that's a painting at the MoMA, which is the beginning of abstract art. It's called Cubism. And it's the ultimate spiritual don't go there moment, because he takes divine love and he paints profane love, these prostitutes of Avignon. But more importantly, he takes them apart and puts them back together again the way he wants to. So that's modern art, right? That's the beginning of that. So these images have like facets of these people. And in one case, he puts an African mask on a woman. It's not her face at all. And from Cubism, everything kind of comes apart at that point, and the artist becomes the creator, and that doesn't work out real well. It's interesting that many of them tried to find their way back. I can't tell you the whole chapter, but it ends well. I'll just leave it there. Yes.
Hi, do you have a least favorite painting?
Yeah, Evelyn and I have this thing where, after the tour, we go to a dinner and we ask everyone to tell us their favorite painting and why. And people unlock a lot of what's going on in their own lives. I mean, we had one on Thursday night. We had two people in tears, actually, separately, talking about particular paintings. And she and I always guess each other's favorite that night. It has to be something different than we've said before, but we can almost tell. I mean, it seems like we're cheating, but we're not. But so any given night, I have my favorite and my least favorite, although I do love all my children, if you know that expression. So I can't tell you I have one I don't like. And if I didn't like them, they wouldn't be in this book. But when you get into paintings that are just utter mockery of Christianity, dung on the Virgin Mary and this kind of stuff, yeah, I probably would list that under ones I don't think are art at all. And it's certainly the anti-thesis of everything that we're doing here with art.
I'm interested to hear how you talked about Cubism as kind of innately less fit to present certain Christian truths. I'd be curious if you had opinions on what the ideal art style is, or if there is one, or what defines something that would be ideal for transmitting Christian thought.
Well, I think you can find Christian thought almost everywhere. I mean, even in Mark Rothko, we find it, actually. But some are easier than others. There's a chapter in the Pilgrimage called The Perfect Synthesis. And it's the only chapter that's devoted to one artist. And that artist is El Greco. And I do think, and I didn't, when I went to Princeton, I didn't understand El Greco. I didn't really like him. I thought it was kind of weird. And Evelyn and I went to a special exhibit in New York about 20 years ago, and really began, of just El Greco, and we really began to see him differently. And then once you start getting into the spiritual element, so what's wonderful about El Greco is he has a lot of modernity to him in how he paints forms and structures in his paintings. They almost look impressionistic, but they're coming from a deep faith, almost mysticism. And he combines those together with Venetian color palettes. Some of you may know that El Greco wasn't a Greek. I mean, well, he was a Greek. He wasn't Spanish. He wasn't really Spanish, but he grew up in Crete about 100 years after the conquest of Byzantium, Constantinople. And a lot of the Byzantine icon painters, which we cover in the pilgrimage, come to Crete, which is under protection of the Venetians. And you have this literal genius of, I mean, highly skilled Catholic mystic growing up in this island gumbo of Byzantine mysticism and Venetian Renaissance color schemes. And he puts it together in a unique way called mannerism. There's other mannerist painters, but really El Greco's the guy. Goes to Spain, paints in Toledo, and we cover a lot of his life and his works in that chapter. It's really special. I call it the perfect synthesis, that chapter. Do we have time for one last question? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. So all of these pictures focus around people or sort of man-made things with the Hopper painting. I'm wondering if you have any like landscape paintings or just focus on nature in this tour, or if so, or if not, what do you think those types of paintings could say about man's search for God?
I think the answer to that question is not really. We don't have a landscape painting in there, although you're getting me thinking maybe we should. I mean, you could certainly see attempts to paint nature as quite beautiful in like a Hobbema or someone like that versus like a Van Rysdale where the landscapes are scary. And you could get into that. We do have a landscape painting, actually, I'm just thinking about it, by Van Gogh. And Van Gogh, I don't have the painting with me, but I think you all know Starry, Starry Night. That's actually in Pilgrimage. But equally in Pilgrimage is another painting called Wheat Field with Cypress. And we delve into Van Gogh's spirituality and his connection or disconnection with God. So he's a pretty well-known guy, so I can kind of give you the snippets. I think you guys would pick up on it. So he started life as a Methodist minister, actually. And so he's deeply Christian. He struggles clearly with relationships. And famously, his brother Theo is the only person he really ever could get along with. Gauguin for a short period of time, but then he tried to kill Gauguin. So that didn't work out so well. And Van Gogh is struggling, and he ends up leaving the church and decides to pursue painting as a path to finding the divine. I mean, it really fits into the pilgrimage. But what you see in Van Gogh's landscapes, to me, is a kind of insight into his own personal relationship with God or lack thereof. One of the wonderful things about Catholicism is we have, this personal relationship with Jesus. You kind of saw it there in the painting we saw, the intercession of Jesus and Mary. And Van Gogh clearly didn't have that person. For him, God was a scary force up in the sky, the starry, starry night, a kind of beautiful starlit night, but a kind of scary one. Or in the wheat field with Cypress, you see the force of God, the wind, who's eventually going to come down and harvest the wheat, which Van Gogh was always worried about. It kind of scares him. And then tragically, he, as you know, ends up committing suicide. So we do have at least one landscape, but I probably, if I had to do it over, I would add a few more. Just so many that you can do,
Well, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you all for coming.